Welcome to The People's Colloquy, a podcast that aims to pierce through the fog around us with the high beam of good conversation. My name is Ntuturo Anthony Ntlapo, aka Scare, IGN Nkalagata, and I'm here at HIP, Housing Investment Partners, an organization led by Putukwane Madisha. My guy, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
No, thank you. No, I'm doing well. Can't complain. Glad to be here.
Fabulous. You've already given us a breakdown of exactly what HIP does and what makes the services special in this particular marketplace. So we are going to dive right into the questions about housing in this particular market, as well as globally and anything in between. So let's get right at it. The organization that you lead is operated by connecting government aims with the private sector and secures finance from the international markets to assist folks who struggle to attain financing for a home. Tell us more about that model and share your thoughts on the principle of private-public partnership.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I think if you had to look at the South African context especially, and that's solely where we operate, you find that when it comes to housing finance and affordability for housing, it unfortunately has been left to a very few and I guess the top echelons of the country. So what we have tried to do here at HIP is to join the government interests of providing housing with private sector interests of seeing a much more prosperous country, which is not an entirely altruistic pursuit. They know that as the country becomes more and more prosperous, private institutions will make more and more money.
Yeah.
I always use the example of BMW sort of pre and post 1994. They were in the country, rightly or wrongly, before 94. Mm-hmm. They sold a number of BMWs to a few black individuals, mainly a white clientele. And then suddenly 94 happens and the market boomed as the black middle class grew. To the point where now I think, there's some versions of, I think the 3 Series or whatever manufacturing here and selling more here than they are outside of Germany. So everyone benefits from a much more prosperous country. And that is why what we're trying to do now at Housing Investment Partners is bring in the likes of the Department of Human Settlements through its state-owned entity, the National Housing Finance Corporation, NHFC. And we've also brought in Old Mutual, who also see the benefits of a much more prosperous country. You can imagine also for Old Mutual as a company, the more households there are, the more people there are owning homes, the more assets there are that need to be insured and the like. So everyone benefits. And for South Africa as a society, it is paramount that we get this right. We have a significant housing shortage in this country. Through urbanization and other factors, the housing shortage is actually growing on an annual basis. We don't have to look far. Let's just look back to 7-8 months ago, July 2021, we have the rise. If you're staying in a back room, you don't have much in terms of assets, you don't have much in terms of service delivery, it is beneficial for you to go out and loot in the streets. You don't have much at home to lose out on. Once you have a home that you own, you know that you want to keep the value of that property intact. So you want the roads system around your home to work. You want the water supply and the electricity supply to be in place. You want the refuse collection there. So you'll actually end up putting pressure on your own local councillors to say, guys, what is happening in our community? You want the schools working, the libraries working. It's beneficial to you personally and financially, but imagine the benefits it provides for a location or a town in general. It's incredible benefits, but they also multiply within themselves and they're very long lasting and can be passed on to future generations.
So it gives people a stake in the country and not just to be people who are observing and working, but actually they want to see their communities growing. They want to see their communities improving. There's something that I often talk about with my colleagues and my friends, which is that the difference we find in many communities is that the schools are of a different caliber. Even though you might find government schools in one area, the school that's not being taken care of, the community also reflects that. In another area where the schools are invested into by the people who live nearby, and the businesses that operate nearby, you start to see the whole community gaining life, you know?
Exactly.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, exactly. And I was going to say, I mean, what we have found is that, the decision making, even within a household, improves significantly with home ownership. To the point, I mean, I want to touch on your point on the schooling. We found that even children's school marks are much better off in owned homes versus rented homes. Yes, there are other factors, and generally people are more well off. But it's that the entire mindset of the household changes, and you start seeing the bigger world around you and how that also impacts on you. And therefore, you'll be a lot more active as a citizen, as a resident in that particular community.
Perfectly. Makes perfect sense. When a person is looking to move from renting a property to buying, what kind of questions should they be asking themselves?
Okay. That's not a simple question as it sounds.
Yeah.
Because there are a number of factors that come into play, I studied finance in university, and I remember one of my lecturers saying, I think it was even a tax lecturer, it's like, one of the things we forget when we make financial decisions is we divorce them from everything else, So someone will end up making a poor financial decision to sort of avoid paying the tax on that decision. But what you forget is, if you got to make a particular investment or a particular expenditure, before the tax is spent, is due, you must have actually incurred that particular finance. So buying a home is similar to that. Number one is, especially if we're talking primary residence, it's a lifestyle decision on top of just a financial decision. Mm-hmm. So when you're renting, you're looking at lifestyle, you're looking at shelter, and you probably, I think those are the two main things. Lifestyle, proximity to work, and such considerations. Shelter, how does the house look? But when you are looking to buy a home, you're now moving into a financial asset. And most probably for most individuals, your biggest financial asset. So now there are much more considerations that have to come into play. If I miss a rental payment or two, yes, it can eventually lead to eviction. Eviction is not necessarily the worst thing in the world in a rental situation, because you will be able to find another landlord that will accept you as a tenant.
Especially now.
Yeah. Look at all the vacancies in Sandton. When you're buying a home, it has much bigger implications. If you default on your mortgage loan to the point of repossession, it's going to be incredibly difficult to rehabilitate yourself and your finances to the point where you can actually purchase another home. So affordability is critical. You have to look at the entire household's finances and see whether the household will be able to afford those payments on a monthly basis. And more importantly, whether the household has resilience against shocks. This is not, a car repossession, pretty simple, furniture or clothing store. If you renege on those debts, the implications on your entire lifestyle are limited. Whereas if it's a mortgage loan, there are serious implications for reneging on that debt and failing to make those payments. So I would look at a household's resilience in terms of handling shocks, because also the timelines are fairly long. All the other debts I was talking about are maybe 6 months to a few years, whereas now you're looking at a debt that's going to be with you for mostly over a 10-year period. So you really want to make sure that you can get to the point of extinguishing that debt, so that the full value of that financial asset you have built, you can enjoy that as a household, and also your future generations can enjoy it. The other things that people often forget is there are a lot of other costs involved. Generally, if I've got a rental bill or I'm renting, my landlord will give me a number, 8,000 Rand. I've got one question to ask most of the times. Is it excluding or including electricity? Oh no, there's a prepaid meter. Cool. I can budget my 8,000. When you have a house that you've purchased, a primary residence home, now there's the payments you're going to make, but that's the bare minimum. You forget about rates and taxes, water, sewage, and the likes. Those payments are mostly just as critical. But also maintenance is critical. When you're renting, that's all on the landlord. Now this is your asset. It's your property that you're going to want to be able to pass on to your children in 30, 40, 50 years' time. So maintenance becomes critical, and you cannot sort of postpone the maintenance of their property or be lax about maintaining the value of their property.
So it seems like it's very easy to get in over your head, and it's a very complex decision that people need to make. Where do you get a helping hand in order to make the right choices when it comes to figuring this whole thing out? Do you need first a financial planner, and then afterwards an estate agent? What services are out there that can actually help you avoid making the error?
Yeah, to avoid some of these pitfalls. I've got to be careful here. There are a number of services out there.
Yeah.
But what you got to ask yourself is, what is the agenda of the other party? Financial planners make commission from selling financial products. That's number one. Estate agents make commission from selling properties. That's number two. Personally, and I bought a couple of properties. The best advice that I ever received when I was entering the property market was from people I trusted who had already purchased properties. For instance, if you speak to an agent, even a financial advisor, they're not going to say to you, "Oh, don't forget that possibly around maybe 5 to 10% of the value." No, not 5, 10. Around about let's say 2 to 3% or 5% of the value of that property will come in the form of costs just in the transfer of the property. If it's not a primary property, meaning that it's newly built. If it's a secondary, moving from one owner to another owner, that's called the secondary property market. There's going to be significant costs involved around that, around lawyers, around transfer fees. And people often forget that. I even had a colleague who works with us in the housing finance business saying, "Oh, Putu, I forgot that I still got to pay the lawyers, after I purchase the house." So that's usually one of the biggest pitfalls. So I would say, if I had to look at purchasing a house, whether it's 100% bond where there's no deposit, or if there is a deposit, I would most probably, if the bank had to ask for a deposit, mentally I would double the deposit amount for costs and other incidental expenses that come with a property purchase. You move into a property, and what you need to remember is that, especially if it's a secondary market, as I mentioned, the previous owner didn't just wake up one day to decide to sell the house and sold it the next day. They most probably had a few years leeway. And what happens when you're about to sell an asset? You tend to stretch it to the max.
Yeah,
so that maintenance I was talking about,
Yeah.
now that hasn't been happening as much. Maybe just some coats, paint coats to cover the cracks, things like that. One of the services I've used, which is pretty critical, is they're sort of structural engineers, but they're property experts, and they can give you a view of the property and what they feel will be like critical, I guess, almost hidden issues in the property.
Anything that needs to be repaired or bear in mind when you go into the decision.
The nice thing about them is, I talked about the interests of the various parties. They earn revenue directly from giving you this advice. They're not earning a commission from anyone else. They're not trying to sell you the work afterwards, so they won't over-report on issues. But they don't come in cheap, unfortunately. They are fairly expensive, but this is the biggest asset you're going to buy. So spending 10,000 Rand additional on someone to go through it. And one of the biggest issues we found in houses, especially older houses, will be the electrical circuitry and all of that. You want to make sure, fire risks, making sure the roof is okay, there are no leaks, making sure that the foundation is right, damp proofing and all those things are in place. So I would look for some of those property consultants that just give you pure advice on the property, that don't have a commission interest at heart. And lastly, the most trusted and cheapest option would be, relatives, friends, family that have purchased properties, that have been through the process, and ask them about their experience and what to look out for.
Excellent. Now, my next thing, a little bit aside from where we were at, but it's about auctions. And auctions, when I think about auctions, you see wheeler dealers, you have to be in the know and connected. They strike me as a place for savvy, experienced hustlers. Are auctions a good option for first-time buyers looking to stretch their money and maybe get a 4-bedroom instead of a 3-bedroom with the same amount of cash?
I think you answered your own question there. The word you used was savvy. And I don't think any first-time home buyer can consider themselves savvy. Without a doubt, yes. There are deals to be made, good deals to be made at auction. Cars, houses, the same thing. I've been advised before to try and purchase. I never buy my cars and buy second cars to go buy a car at auction. I'm like, well, I don't know the first thing about a car, so I'm not going to go buy a car at auction. Let me at least buy something that has someone's stamp of approval behind it, and it's no different with a house. I would probably strongly advise buying buying an initial property at auction, mainly because you don't know the lay of the land, you don't know the steps that need to be taken, you don't know all the considerations to be made in buying an asset on auction. If I was a first-time home buyer, I would actually strongly consider purchasing a property I was initially renting. Because what that does is, as I mentioned, a house is two things. Number one is a provision of shelter, but it can also be a financial asset. And if you're buying it, it's also a financial asset. So at least if I am purchasing an initial property and I've lived in it as a tenant, I know the shelter part. I know, let's say it's a sectional title. I know how the complex works. I know I'm happy with the house. There's nothing falling apart. And now it's just, I can just focus on the finances. How do I actually buy this thing? But imagine now moving into a new area. You don't know the local municipality. You don't know the property market there. You don't know the financials fully either because it's your first house. And then you still want to then buy it. And you're kind of buying it blind on auction. I'm not really advise against that. And look to buy a property I've lived in.
Stay away from auctions if you're a first timer.
Yeah.
I've been searching for a place for my family. And I found that there are complexes where units were sold for 200,000 Rand in 1999. And now they can ask for 1.4 million. A few kilometers away, prices for similar units they're growing, but they're not 7 times over 20 years. How do you spot the areas that have got the growth potential, that have got some hidden value there that you can realize in the future?
Yeah. If you could do that, you'd be a trillionaire. But I want to touch on the point I made earlier about the value investing. So, and I also mentioned the fact that South Africa's property market, South Africa's financial markets are part of a global market. There were times, I would say early 2000s, late 90s, the property market was booming. You could almost trade in property in this country. There were a lot of people, everyone knew of someone who was buying, renovating, flipping, all good. The last 5 years, you try that and see what would have happened to your business.
Since 2008,
it's been rough times. So what I would definitely say with buying property would be, once again, it's that long-term view. Don't try to go out there and beat the market. If it's an initial property, obviously it's where you're going to live. So consider that in great detail. Do I actually want to live here? Do I want to raise my children here? And then the easy things to look for. You want to see how that community looks like. Are the roads in order? What are the pothole situations? What are the traffic light situations? Are the parks nearby? Are they in good condition? Because then at least the local municipality is doing its job. You can just focus now on paying your rates and taxes so that job remains, and then focus on your own house and making sure you keep that well maintained. Now, in terms of price increases, if you're going to be living in a house with the idea of seeing it through to the end of the bond, and then hopefully maybe if you buy a bigger house, you actually keep it as an investment property that you can maybe pass on as a wealth generation tool to your children, then you're not actually that interested in price increases if you're going to be in there for 20, 30 years, right? You worry a lot more about price increases if you're in more of the shorter term game. But let's say now you are buying an investment property. I'd still look to almost like the value elements of the community around that property, as opposed to saying, where are the high growth nodes? Because a high growth node in property price can also be a high declining node, in bad times. So those are always the things you got to look out for. Volatility works in both directions. And in the property market itself, I'm trying to remember these numbers. I'm going to get them slightly wrong, but they'll be in the right ballpark. So if you compare what's happened on the ALSI, which is all the stocks on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and there's also a property index. Unfortunately, it's all property, it's not just residential. And you compare what happened. In 2021, property in South Africa did about 38%. So you think, wow, great investments. The JSE in 2021, I think, was about 28%. You know, you'd be like, property is where I should go. But what happened in 2020? You know, did we forget what happened in March? And so
it's coming up from a low point.
Incredibly low base. And if you look at the same two comparisons, if you look at what happened over the previous 2 years in property, over 3 years, you talked about 2008, over 5 years, property has taken a bashing in this country. And the JSE's actually performed better. So you have to take a much longer term view. Over the longer term, let's say over a good 30-year period, though, the JSE will always outperform property, granted, but the volatility in that performance will be much lower in property than in the JSE. So those are always the things, you know, sort of to consider. And I definitely would not sort of, if I was doing a property investment, look for quick returns. You know, anything below 7 years, I would say, would really be too soon an investment or too short an investment horizon for property.
So the key point: don't try to beat the market. The market is like a casino in a sense. It always comes out on top unless you've got special skills more to
I mean, if you are intimately involved in the industry, then obviously there are things you would know. But even then, you know, I'm quite close to the industry, but I don't try to beat the market. Yeah.
I'm with you. Now, my career is in aviation, and because the organization I work for doesn't fly to Europe at present, the Russia-Ukraine war, for that reason, hasn't had an impact on us operationally, but due to the oil price increases and the weakening rand, the price of fuel will eventually create some financial hurdles. What impact has this recent conflict had on HIP so far?
Okay, so for HIP housing in particular, we haven't really felt the impact yet. I mean, it's happened fairly soon, right? A couple of weeks now. But once again, I talk of the global financial markets.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the impact we can see coming forward. The Monetary Policy Committee increased the repo rate by 25 basis points, so 0.25% in January. 0.25%. I want that number to stick in your head because what happened in Russia? It went from 9.5 prime to 20% overnight. You know, taking a 10.5% increase in the interest rate, we're crying about 0.25%.
It's huge.
So events like that have a rippling effect. We are already globally in an increasing interest rate environment, and that is due to increasing inflation pressure everywhere.
Yeah,
South Africa...
As you open up also from COVID, things are changing as well.
We open from COVID, we spend more, inflation increases. So we're now trying to rope it in. And we, unfortunately, all follow pretty much the entire planet, follows our lead from the States. The US has made it very clear that they are going to be in an increasing interest rate cycle. And that puts pressure on South Africa, inflationary pressure, and we're seeing us now, and also investment pressure. You must remember that I talked about the global market as if I've got $1 here, do I put it in the States, do I put it in South Africa? As interest rates increase in the States, South Africa's investment does not look as... what's the word?
Promising.
As promising an investment. Yeah, I could use that. So yes, we will follow suit and we will continue increasing our interest rates in South Africa. The Russian conflict, I think, I wouldn't look at it from an oil price point of view in terms of the housing market in South Africa, more from an interest rate point of view. And I think that those effects will be coming through and it will just continue putting more and more pressure on our Reserve Bank and the Monetary Policy Committee in particular. And the increase in interest rates, which we already knew was coming over the next 2 years, will most probably come a bit more rapid. So there's a chance that we could get another maybe 100, which is 1%, or maybe 1.5% in 2021. And 2022, and that'll continue into 2023. That puts obviously much greater pressure on a household's ability to pay off its mortgage loan. You know.
So that's basically where some global instability is now coming back to hit us in the pocket.
Just like 2008, in a way.
Yeah. Now, this is a bit more of a macro question, so I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. Financially, things are not going well for many South Africans, you know. For the few South Africans who are able to purchase some property, is it wise to buy property in this country and right now as well?
Right now, I'm going to link it to a previous response where I said, your investment horizon needs to be long.
Yeah.
So if you've got an investment horizon that's longer than 7 years, then right now does not make a difference really. You know, whether I'm buying my property in 2008 or in 2000, yes, overall it might make a big difference, but you know, over a 30-year period, it's not that huge a difference. I would still advise households to purchase property in South Africa. Relatively speaking, on a global scale, South Africa still has incredibly affordable property. You know,
Oh, really?
You get a freestanding 3-bedroom house in South Africa for what you'd pay in the West for. I shouldn't just say the West. I mean, including Australia, New Zealand, most probably the
China as
Hong
well.
Kongs, the Chinas, Singapores of the world. What you'd get for a 1-bedroom apartment. You know, so properties are actually on a global scale fairly affordable in South Africa. It's just that we have a much poorer society. There's that. That being said, we still have 1-bedroom homes in South Africa. You know, you can still purchase a freestanding house for sort of 500,000 to 600,000 rand. And the reason why I'd always go with a property investment, you're not going to make a killing on an investment return spreadsheet if you look at it like that. But if you consider the rental payments you're making, where you will get absolutely nothing out of, right? Okay, you'll get a place to live, granted, but you are making your landlord an investment return.
Yeah.
And if you're planning on staying in South Africa, it means that you're planning on living in South Africa, it means you're planning on renting in South Africa, or you have to stay somewhere. So if that is your decision for the next 10 years or more that you're going to be living in South Africa, definitely purchase a property. At the very least, all the money you're spending on rent will be going into your mortgage bond. You would have to pay a little more extra in. It's slightly more expensive, especially if you get like a 100% bond. But all the money you're putting into that house is actually wealth creation for your household. Whereas if in a rental space, it's an expense to stay somewhere. So property in that sense, rent first buy, almost always makes sense.
So you got to think long term.
Yeah.
That's the key thing here. No, I'm with you. I read a piece titled "There's a Shortage of Skilled Workers, and that's a major risk in South Africa." I'm going to link that in the description. The reason given in the write-up was the Great Resignation. One of the top 5 in that list was real estate, and I was quite surprised by that. But given that there is a shortage in the housing situation, you know, as you've mentioned, it does definitely ring true. As an insider, I wanted to ask you, what opportunities exist in real estate for job seekers and any other go-getters? You know, where should people be looking for opportunities right now?
That's an interesting question. I think I want to answer it by almost a question that one of our previous board chairmen used to always ask, you know, and he'd always ask, is there a housing shortage in South Africa? And obviously the answer was yes. Is the problem growing? And the answer is yes. You know, currently I think we're at about, the housing shortage is close on 2 million or so housing units, growing by about 120 to 200,000 a year. So what I would say is, I would not think of myself as a job seeker if I was entering the job market today. Not just in South Africa, it's a global trend, right? So if you think of back in the day, you'd start on the factory floor at 18, your goal would maybe by retirement age be a foreman or a manager, but your 45 or so year career would be at that one company. The trend we have seen now is people not only take on multiple jobs in a career, in a lifetime, they also take on multiple careers, different industries, you know. So yes, you're interested in property. But if I was entering the market, I would think to myself is, let me see what the issues are in South Africa's property market, where the gaps lie. Property market, I'm including the property finance market in that as well. And say to myself, are there problems I can solve in this market? If you can do that, you will always be relevant in the job market. Employers will always seek your services. You know, so that's the mindset I would take, as opposed to where can I just find employment and be secure?
Okay.
There's no way you can find employment and be secure anymore.
It's a different world.
So find the problems, find innovative ways of addressing them. It doesn't have to be your money or your company to fix it, but if you can show an employer that you can identify a problem and work on a solution to that problem, you'll always be in demand.
Excellent. So with that, we're going to close it out. And Putu, you know, we went to the same school, and many of the men from that institution, they're doing big things. Some are grinding, others are hustling, you leading. leading an organization that is bringing together different facets and players in our economy, the private sector, the government, foreign investors, and trade unions to achieve the goal of creating homeowners who have a stake in the future. So thank you so much for sitting with us, and I wish you and HIP the best in these very volatile times.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Fabulous.
Cheers.
Cheers.